Good morning, and thank you for joining Holocaust Museum LA for Education and Legislation, a holistic response to anti-Semitism. My name is Jordana Gessler, and I am the Vice President of Education and Exhibits at the museum. This program is the first event of a series honoring International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which, set by the UN, is held each year on January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. We are excited to present an esteemed panel of speakers today to discuss ways education and legislation can work together to combat anti-Semitism in our communities and across the United States. By teaching children to be prejudiced and to discriminate, the Nazis set the stage for hatred and violence. At Holocaust Museum LA, we teach children to be empathetic, kind, and respectful in order to create a more dignified future. Every day, our elected and appointed officials work to ensure that these important lessons are carried out. Before we get to our panel, it is my honor to introduce and welcome the Consul General of Israel, Dr. Newman, who will be giving us some brief opening remarks. Dr. Newman is the senior representative of the State of Israel to the Pacific Southwest. Consul Newman is a respected author, academic, and statesman. He has served as a policy advisor to 3 foreign ministers, ambassador to several countries, and most recently as both the special policy advisor to the Director General and as director of the World Jewish Affairs Department. Dr. Newman has been intimately involved in the most current and pressing issues on the global Jewish agenda. So thank you so much for joining us and for giving us these opening remarks.
Thank you, Jordana, and thank you for organizing this most important event. It is my pleasure to join and my honor to join. Allow me to open with recognition and acknowledgement of elected officials who are joining this event. As we see Assembly Member Jesse Gabriel, who's already participating, and those who are going to join, Senator Henry Stern and Congresswoman Maloney. And special thanks to the Holocaust Museum of LA for your ongoing activity to remind us and make sure that we never forget, and at the different activities like this one that we're participating in right now. Thank you. In 2005, the UN designated January the 27th as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I'll reveal a bit of a secret that it was a resolution which was co-sponsored and promoted by the State of Israel, one of the first successes of Israel in the UN. And this, of course, resolution has now perpetuated the memory of the Holocaust every year. We honor the memory of 6 million Jews and the many others that perished during the Holocaust. I just mentioned that my father was a survivor of the Holocaust. His entire family perished in the Holocaust, including his parents and his siblings. So this is a topic which I grew up in throughout my life. In my opening brief words, I'd just like to mention the uniqueness of the Holocaust. We must all remember that the Holocaust stands out for the systematic murder of 6 million people, among them more than 1 million children. Systematic murder of an entire society just on a racial basis. A third of the Jewish population was annihilated during the Holocaust. And this is not an accident or incidental casualty of war. They were hunted down and exterminated due to their race, due to their religious or ethnic identity. This is something very unique and not to be compared to any other kind of war issue or genocide that we know did occur. The importance of Israel is stressed in the context of the Holocaust. Then there was no shield of David to defend the Jews. There was no safe haven for the Jews. Today, thank God, we have a safe haven. We have a home for all Jews, whether they are persecuted or not. And doesn't matter what background they come from, they're all invited and they have a second home in Israel. This is actually the first time in modern history that the fate of the Jewish people is actually in their own hands. We know 3 stages in the development of anti-Semitism. The first stage was the hatred of Jews on a religious background, what is called Judenhass. The second stage was the racist anti-Semitism, as we saw in the Nazi period. And the third stage, which is developing now, is the hatred and demonization of the State of Israel as the one and only Jewish home of the Jews. We should be aware of the fact that this is of the same root and it's leading in the same direction. The delegitimization of the State of Israel is not criticism, it's actually discrimination and anti-Semitism. We are shocked to note that there is a rise in anti-Semitism and hate crimes in the United States as well. And COVID-19, unfortunately, is only accelerating this trend. As a representative of the State of Israel and a career diplomat who has served around the globe, including in Muslim countries, I'd like to mention that in the end, it's up to every individual. Every individual has to decide whether they belong to the radicals or the moderates, whether they spread love or hatred, whether they spread a vision of inclusionism or exclusion. And that's where the importance of education comes in. Education is so important. As Israel develops and helps humanity and innovates for society, we see the enemies of Israel and the Jews who spread hatred, like Iran and other countries, and call for Israel's destruction. These are calls that cannot be ignored, and that is one of the biggest lessons of the Holocaust, that words, rhetoric, then very often turn into action. In the field of legislation, that's a completion of the issue of education. Legislation is so important because it reaches out to the public and it also instills the moral viewpoint. Legislation represents the morals of a society. And that's why it's such an important tool. We applaud Representative Maloney for sponsorship of Never Again Education Act. And we applaud all those who support legislation that will continue the lessons of the Holocaust. We also call for legislating the IRA definition, the working definition of anti-Semitism, and further legislation that will educate the public at large and instill the values that we all believe in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for setting the importance of this talk and discussing the recent rise in anti-Semitism. It's really important for all of us to remember that anti-Semitism did not begin in Nazi Germany, and it unfortunately did not end there. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. A quick reminder to everybody in our audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat box and we will get to them towards the end of our program. We're definitely looking forward to having a lively and informative discussion, and your questions help. So first I'm going to introduce Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel. He represents the 45th Assembly District, which includes much of the West San Fernando Valley. In addition to sitting on 5 standing committees, he currently serves in the Assembly leadership as Majority Whip. He was recently elected by his colleagues as chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, so mazel tov on that. Assemblymember Gabriel has championed efforts to address California's housing and homelessness crisis, strengthen public education, fight climate change, pass gun safety measures, and protect vulnerable communities. We're also going to be joined by Senator Henry Stern, and he represents the nearly 1 million residents of the 27th Senate District, which encompasses communities from Malibu to Santa Clarita. In addition to sitting on numerous committees, Senator Stern has chaired the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee since 2018, where he worked tirelessly to bolster the state's wildlife preparedness, push to have the state address the climate change emergency, improve our democracy, and fight to help some of California's most vulnerable members. He was also recently appointed as chair of the Joint Legislative Committee on Emergency Management. We are also joined with Congresswoman Carolyn B. Maloney. Congresswoman Maloney is a recognized progressive national leader with extensive accomplishments on financial services, national security, the economy, and women's issues. She is currently the chairwoman of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and former chair of the Joint Economic Committee. She was the first woman to hold both of these positions. She has authored and passed more than 74 measures, either as standalone bills or as measures incorporated into larger legislation packages. 12 of these bills were signed into law. Representative Maloney has also been recognized not only by her peers in Congress, but also by outside groups for her ability to elicit change. She sponsored the Never Again Education Act, which was signed into law and supports Holocaust education across the country by bolstering the already expansive education resources at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So thank you all for joining us today. I want to sort of start with a conversation around the importance of Holocaust history. As we all know, the Holocaust was a terrible time in human history. And as elected and official members of the Jewish Caucus, what do you do in your role to ensure younger generations have access to Holocaust education? And sort of I want each of you to spend a few minutes just describing sort of your passion, what makes you interested, what makes this so important to you, and how you in your elected roles work on this. Let's start with Jesse, Assemblymember Gabriel.
Thank you, Jordana, and you can please call me Jesse, and it's just great to be with you, and Dr. Newman, Consul General and my colleague Henry Stern, who does such a great job. And we share a bunch of folks that we represent, and he's a great partner in all of that. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and for putting this together. And thank you for all of the good work that the museum does. These are issues that, the issues of Holocaust education, of making sure that young people in the state of California, that elected officials in the state of California, that our population is aware of the story of the Holocaust and how it came to be and what it meant, and the incredible devastation that it wrought for European Jewry, but also for so many other peoples, is really important to me personally, and also important to our work as a caucus. As somebody who had family that perished in the Holocaust, as somebody who feels very deeply connected to the Jewish community and to our faith and tradition, these are important lessons that we feel as public policymakers need to be taught, not just to young Jews. This is not just a question of our community remembering, but this is something that everybody needs to learn about and that everybody needs to remember. And so we have looked for opportunities to do that. I've only been in the legislature for 2.5 years, a relatively short time. But I will say in that time, some of the things we've done first and foremost is to support the LA Museum of the Holocaust. We were really proud to be able to provide money in the budget 2 years ago to expand your work. And part of what I think was so compelling about that to me from a policy perspective, and to a lot of my colleagues, and why it was a really worthy state investment, was all of the work that you do in communities where people may know nothing about the Holocaust, or they may never have met a Jewish person. We had an opportunity 2 years ago to bring some of our colleagues from the legislature to meet with survivors at your campus in Los Angeles, and to hear their stories and to have them share. And I think it was a really eye-opening experience for a lot of my colleagues in the legislature who may not know that much about the Jewish community or about the Holocaust. But it's also eye-opening for me to talk to some of the survivors and to hear about the conversations that they have with young people, right? To hear about, survivors who've had folks come over and look for the horns on their head, right? Because they're people that they've met that have never met a Jewish person. And that is very consistent with some of the experiences I've had in Sacramento, where I have been very surprised by how many folks in state government and how many members of the legislature know very, very little about the Jewish community and very, very little about the Holocaust. So the work we do to support you is at the top of the list. We do every year in the legislature, we were unable to, it's been a little challenging with COVID, but we've done a big Holocaust remembrance ceremony on the floor of the legislature. It was actually one we did 2 years ago. It's figured very prominently in Henry's personal story, and I can let him share those details, but where we bring survivors up to the Capitol and we have them meet with members of the legislature, and we do some programming. And I will say, candidly, that's programming that we do for the state, but also with an eye towards folks in the building. The program that I helped put together 2 years ago, a lot of it was about the fact that the Holocaust didn't happen overnight. And it didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with rhetoric. It began with education. It began with dehumanization and things that people were taught, and helping both our colleagues in the legislature, the staff that work in the building, people who are watching at home to understand that. So these are things that we take very personally. There's a lot of sort of more specific bills and budget requests that I'm happy to talk about, but I just, I want folks to know, and I want you to know, this is a really important priority for us. We see this as a core part of our mission as a Jewish caucus, and that's why for the one sort of floor ceremony that we get every year, we've always devoted it to the Holocaust, because we think it is something that we have to continue to educate folks about. And certainly, all of the data that we see about, in particular, young people and millennials, the number of millennials who don't know what Auschwitz is, who couldn't give you an accurate description of the Holocaust, that's deeply concerning for us. And so it's something that we've made an important public policy priority for our caucus.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to hear when elected officials believe in the power of education and really acknowledging that hatred is something that is in fact taught. And so we must always educate against it. And when we look at the Holocaust, as you just said so eloquently, it did not begin with gas chambers. It really did begin with hate rhetoric and education and othering. And so it's so important for us to sort of identify those moments and use them to teach people to help recognize when they encounter hate rhetoric. So Senator Stern, a similar question about your role in working with, ensuring younger generations have access to Holocaust education in the state. I know also that you have a very personal connection recently to Holocaust education, and we would love to hear a little bit more about that as well.
Thanks, Jordana. Pleasure to be with you. My personal connection, yeah, I mean, I guess it's a more recent one, but it started much younger. You know, it started for me in 8th grade, and the way I was taught by my social studies teacher in a public high school, and you know, Malibu High, 8th grade Mrs. Ikes, and the way she taught the Holocaust to us was with people. She gave us space actually as students to go organize with this woman, Ellie Summerfield, who's a amazing leader in her own right, but had been doing sort of organizing survivors to come talk to students. And that was, you know, I was 13 years old, coming of age, you know, sort of trying to figure out what to do as trying to be a young leader. You know, you're getting ready for your bar mitzvah, and you then meet Brina Drexler or Rita Lurie or Sidonia Lax, and you suddenly become friends with these people who are your neighbors living all over LA, and I don't know, owning a deli, or you know, being an activist, or being a happy grandparent, or just real people who live amongst you, and everything gets animated and very real day to day. And I think it's that grounding in the sort of normalcy to know that like something is profoundly apocalyptic and unimaginable can actually happen. The resource is still here in Los Angeles, and that's to the assembly member's point. I mean, that's why the caucus has made it central, and that's why Jews have to make education central as our security mechanism for free people, essentially. I mean, not to get too biblical, but when Moses just freed in the last portion, when everyone actually gets out of Egypt, the first thing he talks about is not like a vision of the future, or even looking at the long march of history and how hard it's going to be for 40 years. He just talks about education, just teach your children. And that's still that's how we responded the day Jesse was talking about it with the Holocaust Museum and the survivors, was also the day, I believe, immediately after the Poway shooting. Is that right? So it was Sunday, and then Poway Saturday. I think that's right, because it was during
it was Poway.
Shabbat.
Poway was Shabbat, and then it was Monday.
Right.
We did our Holocaust.
So exactly. So the next day, and I remember talking to Jesse after your event, and we were all, just trying to wrestle with what was happening. And when we called the governor and sort of made a move to say, we got to show up in Sacramento tomorrow and do something. It wasn't just the nonprofit security work that we did, which was, Jesse had a bill, and now we've got a whole framework statewide. Some of it helps places like the museum, some of it helps places of worship. There's an actual security element to feeling like you can be a Jew in this society, or someone else, LGBT centers, or local youth centers, or places that are for the Muslim community, or wherever it may be. Those grants have been distributed all over through physical security measures. But the other piece was, we need to get Holocaust Museum funding. We need to get that item of the budget actually delivered too. Because if we don't make a down payment on that infrastructure, which is not physical, which is a cultural infrastructure, then we're really lost. And that's what's hard, is how do you, it's not as simple in some ways as putting the right fencing or gating or having the personnel, or it's a more complex kind of security problem. But I think it's one that we've got to reanimate. The numbers are terrible in terms of what young people are getting out of their education right now. And not everyone has Mrs. Ikes who lets them take a week off of class and like go organize survivors around. School's stressful, it's hard. So we've been exploring how to copycat or I guess tear off of Congresswoman Maloney's work with the Never Again Education Act federally, and see if there are ways to either update or reanimate existing curriculum and try to push the envelope a little more, especially while we still have the resource of this generation of liberators and survivors. Today, I guess, is it's the memorial of the liberation of Auschwitz, right? And I mean, yeah, folks who went through that still live among us. And yeah, I mean, you guys talked about the other personal connection. Ironically, that same exact day that we talked about, that same Sunday, I got on a flight then after that, after sitting at charcoal, after going through the Holocaust event, talking to Jesse and Senator Allen, our other colleague who was just leading the caucus, and trying to figure out a plan. I got on a flight and met my future wife and her dad, Joshua Kaufman, who's a survivor himself. And since then, I've been sort of immersed in the real life of survivor living, which is, it's not all, it's a lot of speeches still, be honest, even at the breakfast table. It's amazing. It doesn't stop. People like Joshua need a place to give a voice. And I want to let him loose. I want to get him out of my breakfast table and into more classrooms, because that's a very valuable resource to have on your hands. Somebody who lived it as a 14-year-old boy and knows what, other kids are going through now. So it's a big opportunity, and I hope we can double down, tear off some of the federal funding, but also try to make a push at the state level, not just for Jews, not just in religious schools, through all schools. I think it's going to be critical cultural infrastructure against hatred going forward.
So quickly before Congresswoman Maloney joins us, I guess, so for both of you working in California, which is one of the largest states in the country, Los Angeles County has a larger population than many states in our union. How do you sort of understand how California is both a state that mandates Holocaust education, but also there's been an increase of anti-Semitism on high school and college campuses in the state, persistent and growing. So how do we turn the tide of negative education? So how do we sort of use the framework of on the state level to change the bias that's coming out in different communities throughout the state?
I'll let you marinate on it. It's a hard one. I'll take a quick lightning round crack. I mean, my first instinct is give teachers tools, and don't like make it matter, and find ways to work on teacher training and just get really practical about it, and plug in places like the Holocaust Museum into the infrastructure of the education system. Don't try to make this seem like you got to make more space in your calendar. Like use what we've got in the system already and link it better. First instinct, I don't know.
Am I supposed to jump in now? Is that my cue, Jordana?
If you have a thoughtful,
do you have thoughts? I don't know.
I don't know if I ever have a thoughtful response, but I'm happy to share some of my thoughts. Look, these are extraordinarily complicated questions, right? And we have to be honest about the fact that young people are getting a lot of information on the internet, much of which is inaccurate. That there are efforts to promote disinformation and misinformation on the internet. That we saw, I think, very vividly a few weeks ago about how people are being radicalized based on things that are not factually correct. And that's a very scary thing for our country. And I think it's particularly scary for the Jewish community, because we know how this story ends, right? We've seen what happens when people are fed misinformation over and over. And so we really, I think we as policymakers have to double down on finding ways to educate the next generation so that they, one, understand facts and history as they are. People are certainly entitled to different opinions, but there are certain historical facts which are indisputable, and those need to be taught to young people. And they need to be taught in powerful and compelling ways. And I think that's where we need to really lean on organizations like the museum and the Shoah Foundation and others, which are thinking about how do we, educate people about this in ways that are compelling and is going to stick with them. And secondly, we need to think about how do we help young people to ferret out, misinformation and disinformation and some of what they're getting on the internet. And it's an extraordinarily challenging public policy conundrum. There are real there are real challenges that we have with the First Amendment, with federal preemption in terms of what we can do at the state level. The Congresswoman and her colleagues have the opportunity to assume other things. from their perch in Washington, D.C. But I think working on this issue of disinformation and hate speech on the internet and extremism and all of that has to be a top priority for us. And I guess if there's anything that I would feel hopeful about from the events, the just really unbelievable events that happened at the Capitol a few weeks ago, is that maybe it will convince a critical mass of folks in elected office that we have to do something about this. Because if not, we're going to be in a very difficult situation with very significant majorities of our population radicalized and believing things that are objectively not true.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us, Congresswoman Maloney. We were just discussing sort of on the state level, the importance of Holocaust education. And we know that you've been such an important force on the federal level in ensuring that Holocaust education continues. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you. And I think what Jesse Gabriel was saying is so to the point. We saw that when we had the insurrectionists storm our Capitol. I thought I would never see such a thing. But one thing that I'm working on that's very current is the Parler was a platform that was spreading all these lies and helping them plan an insurrection. The language was kill this one, kill that one, awful language. And it's now a debate in the country. Some people are saying that anyone can say anything they want. But I'd say advocating the overthrow of your government, advocating the killing of individuals or anybody doesn't belong on the internet. And it's sort of this radicalism that you saw in Nazi Germany with them storming their state house and the activities that happened that led to the Hitler's rise. It's very frightening how fragile a democracy can be. And I was listening, and I'm just going to say this because I have a speech and everything, but I think this is very relevant to what we're confronting now. In my bill that I passed, I got a pledge of $10 million over 5 years. And we got in this year's budget $2 million. And I would love to see a lesson plan and the teaching that this will be about the Holocaust that connects it with what happened with the insurrection, brings it into how hate speech happened then that allowed this group to take over that was so deadly and killing. I have a prepared speech, I'd better give it. But when you were talking, Gabrielle, I was just thinking that that's where we should go with the Holocaust Museum in Washington to tie it to the current events we're confronting now. What you said really touched my heart. Thank you. I should start? Okay. I would like to begin by thanking the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles for hosting this event today and bringing us all together virtually to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's been 76 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and by coming together on weeks like this, we are taking action to fulfill our vows of never again. In recent years, we've seen an alarming increase in anti-Semitic attacks in my home city of New York, LA, across the country, around the world. The Anti-Defamation League reports an all-time high of anti-Semitic incidents in 2019 since the group started tracking incidents in 1979. That alone is alarming. They recorded 2,100 acts of anti-Semitism, which led to 5 deaths. We saw a 56% increase in assaults from 2018, and the statistics from 2020 have not yet been released, but I can tell you from a personal experience in New York City that these incidents are growing and are still happening. And just a few weeks ago, on January 6th, as Jesse was speaking, we saw insurrectionists take over our nation's Capitol building in shirts that read, quote, 6 million was not enough, end quote, and Camp Auschwitz, end quotes. Anti-Semitism is not a thing of the past. It is not relegated to the history books in the 1940s. It did not disappear with the defeat of Hitler and his Nazis. It's not enough to condemn these attacks and disgusting behaviors. We need to get to the root of hate, denial, and intolerance that allow and incite these behaviors. And in my opinion, as a former teacher, I believe that we do this through education. Our children, our students are not born with hate in their hearts. Prejudice and discrimination are learned behaviors, and it's up to us to make sure our children never learn them. As a former educator, that I can tell you from firsthand experience that the hardest part of the job is coming up with the lesson plans. They take a lot of time to put together. A lesson plan for something as difficult for students to understand as the Holocaust makes this so much more difficult. And this is not a burden that our teachers should bear alone. That's why I introduced and passed just last year the Never Again Education Act to give our educators the tools they need to meaningfully teach about the Holocaust and the dangers of anti-Semitism, intolerance, and hate. Now law. This bill expands the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's already impressive education programming and requires the museum to develop and disseminate accurate, relevant, and accessible resources to teachers all across the country to promote understanding about how and why the Holocaust happened. Funding will support a centralized website that will serve as a database for high-quality curriculum materials. Holocaust education is now required in 16 states, including in my home state of New York. And I can tell you that I've reviewed the curriculum in New York and other states, and it's absolutely excellent. So why should we have to force someone to reinvent the wheel? Let's put those lesson plans up that teachers can access all across this country. Specifically, the Act authorizes $10 million over 5 years for this programming and will allow the museum to expand their professional development programs for teachers, increase engagement with state and local education leaders, and to evaluate and assess the effectiveness and impact of Holocaust education programs. I first introduced a version of this bill, believe it or not, in 1999, and it finally passed through the Congress last year with overwhelmingly bipartisan support, showing the country that combating anti-Semitism is and must be something we all agree on. I'm very proud of the vote. It was roughly 415 to 5. It was the most bipartisan bill that we passed, and what I would say was the most partisan Congress I'd ever lived in. So the work that you do at the Holocaust Museum of LA is so important, and I'm hopeful that with this new funding for the Holocaust Memorial Museum, we'll be able to reach even more students through Holocaust education. Far too many students in our country grow up without basic knowledge of the horrors of the Holocaust. In a 2018 survey, 2/3 of American millennials could not identify what Auschwitz was. And many believed that Hitler came to power by force, not by being democratically elected. Thankfully, there are still Holocaust survivors willing to share their stories, but it is more important than ever that we preserve their stories and their personal history of the Holocaust so that it cannot be distorted or denied and is preserved for generations to come. The lessons of the Holocaust do not just apply to anti-Semitic behavior, but to all forms of intolerance, hate, and bigotry, which is why last year, in addition to passing the Never Again Education Act, I held a hearing in the Committee on Oversight and Reform, which I now chair, entitled 75 Years After the Holocaust, the Ongoing Battle Against Hate. During the hearing, we discussed what we can do to ensure that future generations never forget the lessons of the Holocaust and how these lessons can help us combat all instances of hate, bigotry, and intolerance. The hearing was part of a broader investigation into the threat of white supremacy in our country. We have seen a sinister increase in hate crimes, not only against the Jewish community, but against Black Americans, Muslims, immigrants, and others. The lessons of the past must inform our approach to fighting hate today. After the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack against the American Jewish community in our nation's history, a group of Holocaust survivors who volunteered at the Holocaust Museum in DC wrote to the Pittsburgh Jewish community in solidarity, explaining why they dedicated their lives to sharing the horrors they experience. And I quote from what they wrote: "We seek to remind people, especially young people, our country's future leaders, that hate can never be ignored. Complacency is dangerous. Standing up and pushing back is the only way we can make a better future." End quote. As the saying goes, if we do not learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. It is our responsibility to ensure that our students learn these lessons and that educators have the tools they need to teach them. Thank you so much for having me today, and I would love to take any questions.
Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. I know that you had such important work spearheading Holocaust education legislation on the federal level, especially since 1999. And I'm wondering where you see the future of Holocaust education from a federal perspective in the next 3, 5, and 10 years, especially as you mentioned, Holocaust survivors are so critical in understanding the lessons of the past, as there are fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors able to share their stories.
Well, I think it's very important for the future to preserve Auschwitz and Birkenau. I think it's very important to develop the educational materials and make them available to teachers. And I think that one of the reasons that I got so involved in it is that in reading history, it was about the cruelest thing I'd ever read about. I couldn't believe that a democratic country would turn on their own people and kill them. I couldn't believe that this could ever happen. I will tell you, and as a former teacher, I saw the answer to the challenge always through better education, which is, I believe, the answer to many of our challenges, including fighting hate, bigotry, and intolerance in all ways. And so I do want to share that in 2014, I went to Auschwitz. It was a remembrance. I believe it was the 68th remembrance of the liberation of Birkenau and Auschwitz. And there was a Republican and Democratic delegation that went. I represented the Democratic side, and Eric Cantor was the Republican side. And I thought that it was so moving. 69 countries participated, but the most moving sight was when members of the Knesset came, elected, free, democratic country, a strong country that they tried to kill their people and stop it from ever happening, were walking in, holding the hands of Holocaust survivors and over those terrible lands that had killed so many people.
I'm sure that was an incredibly empowering experience and moving experience.
For us, it was unbelievable.
As someone who's worked on the federal level for a number of years, what advice would you give our two other panelists who work on the state level to enact education reform and protection of civil liberties within the state? What advice would you give them in spearheading Holocaust education legislation, as well as to our viewers, many of whom are active participants and civic leaders within the Los Angeles community?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, you have to have a plan. Moses traveled in the desert for 40 years because he didn't have a plan. So you're going to be walking in circles if you don't know exactly what it is you want to accomplish. So you've got to have your plan. And then I always work from a document. It makes it easier to educate people about what you're trying to do. The document I work from is a piece of legislation. I try to author my plan so that legislators and others know exactly what I want to accomplish. It can be changed. And if you are just lobbying, you may not have a piece of legislation. You'll have a memo explaining the bill that you would like someone to introduce. And so first you start with your plan, then you need your document that you can work around. Doesn't mean you can't change it. I have trouble with my staff who write bills all the time and they keep writing them. I said, stop, just get the document out there. Other people will help us figure out how to make it better. We don't have to do that. Once you have the document, all forces come in to talk to you about it. They either like it, they don't like it. Why aren't you doing it this way, that way? All of these ideas come in and they make your document stronger. then you have to build a core of support. You can't do it alone. You need everybody you possibly can find to support it. So you start with if you're going to your state legislatures, you're getting a Republican and a Democrat, I happen to be a Democrat, to lead it, to be the lead sponsor. And then I do what I call the drum beat. Like the Indians, the drums would get louder and louder and louder. And what you do is you just keep beating the drum, making more people aware of it. I would send out like a dear colleague talking about the bill and why people should be on it. If there was an incident of anti-Semitism, I'd send out another document. You should be on this bill, trying to educate it and trying to get hearings within the bodies to raise awareness. A very big breakthrough that came to me when I did this bill is that I was speaking before a JCRC, and I was speaking about the bill and how I was trying to pass it. And it just so happened that the international head of Hadassah was in the audience. And afterwards she said, I want to help you with it. Let me see if I can get my organization to endorse it. She got Hadassah to endorse it, which is unbelievable. I call it I shouldn't use this analogy, so I'm not. It's in every neighborhood, it's in every community, in every state. So you have a built-in ability to lobby nationally through Hadassah. And then I met with the ADL. They made it a priority and they started lobbying it. And so many Jewish organizations came in supporting it, and then educators started endorsing it. And then we just got so many people. I felt it was a bill that made so much sense that if I could get it to the floor for a vote, it would pass. But I never could get it to the floor. They would never give me the floor time. So I went out and I got roughly 400 co-sponsors. There are only 435 members of Congress. Practically everyone in Congress co-sponsored it. So it had to pass, and it passed almost overwhelmingly, which was really exciting, and a very divided Congress to see such joint support for it.
I want to be very respectful of your time, Congresswoman. And so I was wondering, Jesse or Henry, do you guys have specific questions you would like to ask?
One follow-up question, actually, Congresswoman, and as we seek to implement your legislation at a state level, we're thinking of introducing our own Never Again Education Act to tier off of some of your federal legislation, build on it. But I guess the other topic that's really been a focus here today, and you and the Assembly member both brought it up, but was this domestic terrorism issue. And I'm wondering, we're thinking about conducting our own hearings, looking at our threat assessment center. So the Department of Homeland Security did have, under the Obama administration, much more oversight in this arena. And it looked like the last administration cut a lot of the funding in domestic terrorism and tracking, and the fusion centers were all defunded, including California's. Do you see that issue gaining traction in this Congress? Do you see the Congress sort of taking that issue on beyond just the condemnation? Obviously, the impeachment has been dealt with, but really targeting some of these groups that are planning further insurrections all over the country?
I think absolutely. You have to first and foremost, you have to support your government. You have to support your leaders. We know that they had maps of how to get to certain legislators' offices that are very hard to find. We know that they had constructed this building on the grounds of the Capitol to hang people. They had the noose hanging down, and they had these strips that you could capture people. They came very close to capturing the Vice President of the United States. And they had earlier on Parler been tweeting and sending out things that they wanted to kill him. So all of this has to be looked at very, very seriously. We will be having investigations. I have called for several of them. What was very disturbing, we found 12 different police officers who were part of the insurrection. These were off-duty police officers that swore to protect people and to protect our form of government, and yet they were participating in an attempt to overthrow the government. They literally succeeded for several hours of closing down the proceedings. We had a constitutionally mandated responsibility to certify all of the Electoral College votes for President Biden. They disrupted that. You know, we had to go hide the ballots. We were afraid they were going to come and steal them. And, you never know. It was very frightening. And what was so frightening to me is that I felt like I'm an American. We have a strong democracy. This could never happen in America. We respect the peaceful transfer of power. But I think when you study Germany, you see how fragile a democracy is. He was elected. Can you believe that? Hitler was elected. That's hard to believe. They stormed the Capitol, his followers, and got away with it. And he still got elected. But it shows you how fragile a democracy is and how we have to all work to protect our government. I don't know what would have happened if they had reached their goal of capturing Vice President Pence and Speaker Pelosi. I don't know if they'd be alive today. I don't know. The language on Parler was beyond belief. And I think that we should take what happened there and make the lessons of the Holocaust more alive by bringing it into incidents that we, at least I never thought I would ever see the day that our capital would be taken over. And if they had gotten hostages, they probably, who knows what would have happened, but none of it would have been good. And so it was a very frightening thing that we lived through. We need to understand who funded it, who planned it, who made it happen. And I certainly believe in free speech. I have many conservative friends. They are free to say whatever they want. I applaud their ability to say whatever they want, but having speech that goes over the line and advocates killing people is over the line, and we've got to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. I really have loved this opportunity to talk to you. I hope we can stay in touch. I hope we can have an exchange of ideas of how we can fight together against bigotry and intolerance in our country. And I personally, on Inauguration Day, loved President Biden's theme of unity, of coming together. Let's work together. Let's make it happen. And let's make this country stronger for all of our people. And I thank you for the honor of being with you. And I thank you for wanting to hear about my legislation. I'm honored by it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to have a senior Democratic Congresswoman speak on a panel with us and with other elected officials here in California. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It was my joy, my pleasure.
So as we start to wrap up, I want to bring us back to a local question to Henry and Jesse. There's a question in the audience about your opinions on the latest version of this California Ethnic Studies curriculum. And if you could speak a little bit to if you've worked with it, if you've had conversations either on the legislative side or other around the curriculum. I see, Jesse, you've already unmuted, so you're ready to go.
Okay, sorry, I was just going to thank Congresswoman Maloney, but I'll tackle this. And I just, if it's okay with you, Jordana, I guess just want to add on to one thing that she was saying. I mean, one of the reasons I think it's so important to study the Holocaust is not just, because it's an important moment in Jewish history and world history, but because it teaches us about the fragility of democracy and the fragility of society, right? I mean, you think about the Holocaust happened in Germany, this country that, is this bastion of great artwork and music and literature and philosophy and, just this, bastion of what we would consider liberal Western values, right? And the Jewish community in Germany was deeply integrated into that society, right? I mean, people had lived with Jewish neighbors for years. There were Jews in prominent positions of government not too long before the Holocaust happened. And so I think it's a warning to all of us as we consider contemporary events, which Senator Stern and Congressman Maloney talked about how quickly things can unfold and unravel, right? And how a society that is modern and Western and thoughtful can go from that to people murdering their neighbors and being active and willing participants in genocide among their neighbors, how quickly that can happen, and how vigilant we have to be against that. So I think that's another reason why studying the Holocaust is so important, not just for us as the Jewish caucus or Jews, but really for our society and for our democracy. The ethnic studies is it's a very complicated question, and we could probably spend an hour and a half talking just about that. And our Jewish caucus has been deeply involved to the extent that we can be. This is a curriculum that's being written by the Department of Education, and so we as legislators don't have the ability to write curriculum. That's a pretty strong line between who writes the curriculum and who doesn't. But we certainly were extremely vigorous in objecting to the first version of the curriculum that came out. It was frankly just shocking and reprehensible. The way I describe it is not just stuff in there that was anti-Israel, but sort of what I would describe as sort of like classic old school anti-Semitism, right? I mean, read this, I mean, literally go look at the original draft. There's poetry in there or song lyrics about how Jews manipulate the media. I mean, it's just shocking to me that a curriculum in the state of California in the year 2020, a draft curriculum could include that types of lessons. So our caucus was extremely vocal. We were able to really put the brakes on it. As I think the governor came out and apologized for that draft. There was a lot of work done at the Department of Education to reconfigure things. I think that they're moving in a much more positive direction right now. The writing of the curriculum has not finished. It's still a work in progress, but I think most of the Jewish organizations that are now at the table are very pleased with the direction in which things are moving. There's still differences of opinion and work to be done. But I do think things are moving in a very positive direction, and that's the result of a number of things, but also in large part our community getting involved. And one of the people who's brought into the process of developing the curriculum is Dr. Anita Friedman, who's a very prominent scholar and community leader in San Francisco, who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, who's very involved in efforts up there. And so she's been involved in the curriculum, and I think has added some very helpful feedback and perspective. So I think we're getting to a place where people are going to be hopefully feel a lot better about this curriculum. Again, we're not the process is not done, and so we're going to continue to be very vigilant about this. But it's certainly been a really important priority for our community and for our caucus. And I was looking at this original version of the curriculum. I have 3 little kids, the oldest who's 5, and I said I couldn't send my kids to public school in California if this is what they're going to teach. And we had exceptionally strong reactions among members of our caucus. Our colleague Rebecca Bauer-Cahan, who's the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, said this is what happened in Europe, right? They started teaching young people things about Jews, and we saw it where it ended. So I think it was really good and important that our caucus was paying attention to this, that the broader Jewish community was paying attention to this. A lot of organizations have in the community have spoken up and helped to push this in a more positive direction. And so I don't want to say that we're all the way there yet, but I think things have moved in a much more positive direction. And a lot of the ADL, the AJC, federations, others I think are feeling a lot more comfortable about the curriculum now than they were certainly a year ago.
Thank you. And I mean, you're so right in the importance of us understanding that the Holocaust is not sort of just a Jewish story, but it's very much a human story, one in which we see the capacity of people to do horrific, terrible things to one another, but we also can see the capacity of human beings to do the most courageous things for one another. And I guess as 2 elected officials representing different groups within the state of California, wrapping up at the end of their program, what advice would you have for our listeners, for our participants, for the people who are joining us today? From you guys as elected officials down to the constituents, what would you want us to leave with as sort of action items?
I'll let you're the closer, Jesse. How about that? Action items on my end. Listen, the curriculum question, I think we still need, even if whatever this ethnic studies curriculum that comes out is satisfactory and doesn't contain the kind of bias we were worried about, it's still not sufficient. I think that be unsatisfied with the state of education in terms of how to actually build tolerance more deeply and empathy in a way that beyond tolerance and actual empathy for what it's like to be an other in society. If we only focus on those historically racialized minorities, we're not going to give young people the tool to realize that, being a white person, you can be other as well. And that that solidarity that it actually can actually be germinated there if we do this right. That young white kids growing up in the school will have a lot more in common with somebody who walks around with, say, the son or daughter of a first generation farm worker, or even many generations back, someone who's the son of or daughter of and great grandson or daughter of former slaves. You know, my wife was just saying, like, it's interesting for her at a personal level to go through these Holocaust remembrance days and these kinds of ceremonies, because for her it's like all it means to her is like, I don't know where I never met my grandmother, you know, basic stuff like I don't know, you know, and my dad doesn't sleep, you know, just sit, like, to live with it that way. She says she can only imagine how it feels to be someone else going through some other kind of historic trauma, but to have that sort of sense of isolation, maybe, and a sense of otherness in yourself, right? That you feel different than other people, and that it's sort of part of you somehow. I don't know. The more we can share that, I think the better off this next generation's going to be, and they'll fix it all. Because I don't know. No offense to the current leaders, but we're going to need some major changes if we're actually going to be durable as a free society going forward. And yeah, so that would be my takeaway: is let's go work on some education push here in California this year. Let's go see if we can build on that Never Again Education Act from the Congresswoman, and get some done in California, and really utilize the museum and sort of the other education leaders to make it happen.
Thank you, Senator Stern. Any last remarks, Jesse?
Yeah, I guess just thank you for all the work that you do, Jordana, and for all the work that the museum does so beautifully and so importantly for Los Angeles. You know, this is this trauma that is so central to a lot of us in the Jewish community, but you know, Henry and I are sort of we're elder millennials, I guess is the way we describe it, and we know that there's a lot of people our age and younger for whom this is maybe a footnote in history, unfortunately. And I think we have to be honest about that lack of awareness, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that this is, you know, the stories and the lessons of the Holocaust are taught to the next generation, and really not even the next generation, but our peers, our contemporaries, people who are starting to work in government and in positions of power, and be involved in our society. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do. I'm grateful that we have the museum and we have other institutions that are doing that work. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon those of us in government to find ways to work with you, and to support each other's work. And you know, that's been a real, I would say that's been one of the highlights of my short time in public service, has been to partner with organizations like the museum. But we have a lot more work to do, as Henry laid out. And so I think you know, the only way we're going to get that done is in partnership and in collaboration. And so we are, you know, as you know, I'll say, as the chair of the caucus, as the chair of the Jewish caucus, and as a member of the legislature, we're very eager to continue and grow that partnership, because, you know, we live in this beautiful, diverse state of 40 million people. You know, I happen to represent a district where you can drive down Ventura Boulevard and go from, you know, Valley Beth Shalom to Mitzvah Land to Tel Aviv Grill, but there's a lot of the state that doesn't look like that, and a lot of people that don't know much about the Holocaust and about our history. And I think we have a real obligation to make sure that they're aware of it. So thank you for this program, and thank you for the work you do in furtherance of that mission.
Thank you both so much. The citizens of the 45th Assembly District and 27th Senate District are so fortunate to have you as representatives, and we are in the museum are very fortunate to have you, to call on you as friends, thought leaders in the community. We're really very appreciative for you guys to take the time on this Tuesday early morning to speak with us and our guests. So thank you also everyone for joining us for this really informative talk. I think we all are going to leave with something to consider, to contemplate, and to really think about how we as individuals can make an impact on our community, our society, our government. For those of you who don't know, tomorrow is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We will have an additional full day of programming scheduled to commemorate this day, which coincides with the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. You can find a link to our website in the chat box where you can register for all of these events, including a concert with German pianists, film screenings and survivor talks, and including one fully in Italian, of course, because Italy was the sponsoring country in the UN for designating Holocaust Remembrance Day as January 27th. We hope to see all of you there. As always, visit our website, visit our YouTube page where we have a number of different public programs that you can learn from and share. As we said today, education is so vital and so important. And thank you so much for joining us.